Good morning.
Good morning.
You look very alert today compared to last night. And I found it very moving to hear all the countries that were represented here. We've been to many of those countries. In fact, Jen and I were counting it up. We've been to 85 different countries. And we're going to Slovenia from here, and that'll make 86, a new one. That's right, yes. I've spoken in many of these countries, and when I go to different places, I find cultures really are different. You go to South Korea and Japan, and people will sit there straight for an hour and a half and listen to you. They never cross and uncross their legs. They never move their arms. They just sit there very politely for an hour and a half. I don't know what's going on inside them, but on the outside, you can't tell. You go to a place like Brazil, and you know what's going on inside them. They laugh, they cry, they come up afterwards and hug you. You go to a place like Scandinavia or parts of Europe, and again, you have no idea what's going on inside. They don't smile, they just sit there the whole time. And then they come up afterwards and say, "That was the most moving sermon I have ever heard in my life. I didn't even know you were alive because you just sat there." But here we're all together, so you can do anything you want. If you're from Scandinavia, you can actually hug someone. It's okay. It's okay. And if you're from South Korea or Japan, you can cross and uncross your legs or move your arms. That's okay. It's okay. We're here. We're together. So enjoy yourselves. Publishing hope in crisis times. I once saw a movie called Black Robe about the indigenous people in the United States, Indians, American Indians we call them. And there was a chief. These two Jesuit priests were trying to talk the chief into letting them teach his warriors to read. And he couldn't understand, why would you spend time doing that? We could teach them to hunt. We could teach them to shoot arrows. We could do other things. Why would you teach them to read? And so he showed him a book, and he said, in this book there is much knowledge, but it didn't look very impressive. It looked like pepper sprinkled on a page. And the chief looks at this, don't waste my time. And the Jesuit priest was trying to figure out, how can I convince him of the value of reading? So he said, I got an idea. He said, tell me something that I could not possibly know. And the chief thought for a moment, and he said, my wife's mother died in the winter. Oh, I'm so sorry, said the priest. And then he wrote down, the chief's wife's mother died last winter. And he gave it to a friend, and he said, take that over to my colleague, the other priest. And so he ran over to the colleague, and immediately the colleague had a shocked look on his face and came running over to the chief and said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your mother-in-law. And the chief shrank back in alarm. How did you know this? Well, because I read it. Because he passed a message. And that gets across what reading does. It's a way to transfer from one person to another person across time and space, to join them together in an intimate way. In some ways, reading may be the weakest medium. If you read somebody like Marshall McLuhan, he talks about how knowledge was transmitted over the years, and during most of time, there was stuff going on. So, for example, in the caves, generally it was an oral history, and people would either sing the great stories, the great myths, or recite them. But there's a fire in the cave, and babies crawling around, and stuff going on. It wasn't this private act. And even the New Testament epistles, we read these New Testament epistles, but they were letters that were delivered orally. So people didn't sit there studying like we study the book of Romans. They were read to. Maybe they would be even in the catacombs or someone's house, and they're hearing a letter from the Apostle Paul. They knew the Apostle Paul, and it was a very different experience than for us, where we pick up a book that was written a couple thousand years ago and try to reproduce that same experience, but we're alone, and unless you have children, there's not a lot of noise going on, or if you have teenagers, forget it. You'll never have privacy, you'll never have quiet. But that puts a lot of pressure on writing. Writing is so much harder. To reproduce what is normally transmitted in a sensory way in a private transaction, that's very hard. I likened it one time, it's like you've got a tree, and the tree includes all these different branches and leaves and all this. And then as a writer, somehow I have to take this tree and compress it down into a nut, which is where trees come from, and then give you a nut, you're my reader, and let that tree kind of grow inside you, which reproduces the experience I had in writing it. But I don't see you, I don't know you. And all we have is these little pepper marks on page. So in some ways they're so weak compared to, say, you go to a Hollywood movie and the filmmakers have plotted out when the movie music should be dramatic and tense and when it should be calm and soothing with the violins and when it should go up again and the colors of the movie change to bright red because it's anxious and there's a climax coming on. And they've got all sorts of things going. They've got a dark room, they control you. And I find that's true in speaking too. There are certain things that I can do if I find I'm losing my argument, my audience. I try to come up with something funny so all of you except the Scandinavians can laugh. And, or I can talk louder. Or I can shut the door and say, look up here, or I can embarrass you, you're falling asleep. You know? I've got various, not very healthy, but I've got various ways to get your attention, to force you to listen to me. But when I'm writing, I don't have any control at all. You control whether you turn this page or not. So in some ways it's a very weak medium. And you've got to, how many of you are writers, actually? Okay. Look around you, those of you who are publishers and editors, and be merciful. It is a very hard thing. You're asking us to do something dramatic, but you take away all the levers we could have to control you, to manipulate you. Writing is the weakest medium, and yet in some ways it's one of the strongest media. Because it's that private thing. When I'm sitting in a movie, when I'm sitting here, my mind can go all sorts of directions. I think I can control you, but I can't. I don't really know what's going on inside you. But when I write, and you pick up a book that I wrote, you control the gate. Hollywood doesn't control the gate. I don't control the gate as a speaker. You control the gate. And what happens is it creates a kind of intimacy and a safe place where I can talk about things in a very intimate and personal way that I couldn't get away with in a group like this. I was a magazine editor for teenagers, and we had a column called Love, Sex, and the Whole Person. And we would do these surveys about the readership, and the readership of certain things were 50%, 60%. The readership of that column was 99%. We had hormones going in their favor. And teenagers feel sexual urges, but they don't really feel comfortable talking about it. And if you're parents and you've tried to have those conversations with your teenagers, you know what I'm talking about. Oh, mom, oh, dad. Nobody wants to talk about that. That's embarrassing. I already know all that. But actually, they have great curiosity and they have a lot of questions. And we could reach them in that kind of private transaction in a way that no sex education class in their school would ever do, or even a conversation with their parents. They could trust us because it was up to them and they could make their own decision about, does this sound true or does it not sound true? And that's the kind of private transaction that writing allows. I've had a good description of writing from an American author named Philip Roth. He says this, because the experience of writing does strip away all sensory experiences, and yet we're somehow reproducing them in you. This is what Philip Roth how he describes his day. I turn sentences around. That's my life. I write a sentence and I turn it around. Then I look at it and I turn it around again. Then I have lunch. Then I come back in and write another sentence. Then I have tea and turn the new sentence around. Then I read the 2 sentences over and turn them both around. Then I lie down on my sofa and think. Then I get up and throw them out and start from the beginning. He's just described my day. Remember those writers you adopted a few minutes ago? Be nice to these guys. This is what we do all day long. My wife was a social worker when we lived in Chicago, and she would come home with these amazing stories of running into homeless people who had been living in a car for a month, that kind of story. And she'd tell one story after another, and then she would say, well, what about your day? I said, I know, at noon, the mailman came. And, oh yes, at 2:30 this afternoon, I found just the right adverb. I found a very good adverb. And that was it. That was the highlight of my day. I turn sentences around, and then I scratch them out and start new sentences. So in a way, it's a great challenge to be a writer. We have this weak medium that we're trying to transfer something across time and space to you, and yet it does have its own peculiar strength. Jacques Ellul, the French sociologist, says, consider the fact that when God wanted to communicate, he chose the most freedom-enhancing medium there is, the logos, the word. I mean, there are times in the Old Testament when God shows some of his glory, and what happens? People run away. They're afraid. Moses would go into the tent of meeting in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, and when he would come out, he would be glowing, and people would say, I can't look at you. I can't look at you. Put a veil over your face. We can't even stand to be with someone who just was in the presence of God. And it didn't inspire intimacy. You didn't want to know that God. You shrank back in fear from that God. And God found a way to communicate God's own self through the Logos, through the Word. The most freedom-enhancing style of communication. God respected words. He didn't rely on Hollywood soundtracks. He didn't rely on blazes of glory. The word all the way through. And you can see that he's gradually moving away from those dramatic displays that you see in Exodus and in Deuteronomy and even in Joshua, but gradually God turns it over to the prophets. And except for the first couple of prophets, Elijah and Elisha, then the miracles stop and God relies on the word. It's as if he was waiting for that maturity so that the Israelites could hear the words directly and not need all this razzmatazz over here. And then when God became one of us, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's very intentional. That God chose the easiest way to reject God. The most freedom-enhancing way. When I sometimes speak at Christian or secular universities, I'll say, I know some of you here are wondering why you're listening to a Christian speaker, and you wish you weren't here, and I understand that. And yet I challenge you, especially you philosophy majors, especially you agnostics who are so proud of your atheism, I challenge you to find a single argument against God that is in the old atheists, people like Voltaire, David Hume, Bertrand Russell, or the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. I dare you to find a single argument against God in those guys that is not already included in the Bible. Job, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Jeremiah. Psalms again and again. And I don't know about you, but I have respect for a God who not only gives us the freedom to reject God, to turn against him, but actually gives us the words that we can use in the sacred scriptures. God is a freedom-respecting God, and he chooses the most freedom-enhancing medium of communication. Reading requires a lot of the reader. You have to decode things. When I look at this, from a distance, it does look like pepper on a page, but actually, every time I read, I do this assembling process, almost like a computer reading code, where I take these little shapes and assemble them into, oh, that's a word, and it fits next to this word, and there's a very strong word, and oh, it's a sentence, and then here's a paragraph. Now, those of you from Asian languages that use pictographs and symbols, you have a leg up on the rest of us, because the symbol itself conveys something of the meaning. We don't have that. Those who use an alphabet language, they're just kind of arbitrary shapes, and we have to put them together. But that's an active exercise of the reader, putting together these symbols, and then it engages the mind. It requires a focus. It requires kind of a meditation, which again is something that enhances that deep form of communication. It's not just seeing a picture and hearing something, and so many movies. Janet and I will start watching a movie and we'll turn to each other, didn't we already see this? Yeah, and I'll look up a computer file. Sure enough, 5 years ago we sat there and watched this very same movie. That doesn't happen to me when I read a whole book. I at least remember reading that book. I usually have notes in the front of it. But it's because you're passive. You're watching a movie. They're doing it to you. When you're reading, you're doing it to them. You're doing it to the words. I just published a memoir called Where the Light Fell. And it's been interesting to me to see the reactions to it, the responses I've gotten, emails and letters. I would say at least 90% of the responses I get are not about me. They're about the reader. And I figured out that's why we read memoirs. To get ready to write this memoir, I read every memoir I could get a hand on for years. I read more than 300 memoirs just to figure out, how do you write a memoir? I'd never written one before. I wanted to find out. And the reason I kept reading is because no matter how good or bad the book was, and I read a lot of really bad memoirs, but every one of them triggered a memory in me that I wouldn't have retrieved if I had not read that book. So I read not to find out about the person writing, but to find out about myself. And memoirs do that. In fact, reading always does that. It's a way of that transaction between the writer and reader that is intimate, that stirs up stuff in you that you had forgotten. There's a Walker Percy who said about fiction, some of you have written fiction, he said, fiction doesn't tell us what we don't know, it tells us what we know, but don't know that we know. And memoirs don't tell us something about me. It tells something about you, but you had forgotten that. I bring it to the surface in writing my memoir, and the same was true of all the memoirs that I read, one way or another. It's the most non-threatening form of communication. I grew up, as the memoir tells, in kind of angry Southern fundamentalism, and we would have these revivals that would come in every year, and they would use all the techniques of shouting and screaming, and we'd be there waving fans, and it's so hot, and we had everything going for us, those sensory experiences, and yet I'm shrinking away, because if I had a question about the problem of pain or prayer, as Alice mentioned, they would just say, just believe. Well, I didn't want to just believe. I wanted to be convinced. And they weren't convincing me. They were just yelling. And then I later heard there were intelligent Christians around, people like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton. I had never met an intelligent Christian, but I had hope that they were out there somewhere. And eventually I discovered them. and found that there could be healthy faith as well as unhealthy faith. So there's that dichotomy, and on the one hand, reading and writing is such a weak medium. It's so thin. On the other hand, it's such a strong medium. It's that transfer directly from me across space and time inside you. It can change you. And we live in a time when we have things available to us that have never existed in the history of the world. So anyone in this room can tonight sit down in your room and write a blog or a posting on Facebook that could be read in 50 countries. In fact, I wrote a blog shortly before coming over here and mentioned some things going on in Ukraine right now. And the very next morning, I got an answer from a woman in Ukraine. And she said to me, I've read 8 of your books in Russian, because of course they are taught Russian in schools. And Anna is here. Thank you, Anna, for getting these books out all over. And she said, I read 8 of your books over the years, but now I am living your books. And she went through and mentioned things. And she wrote it in Ukrainian. I had to hit the Google Translate button just to see what she was saying. But there's that magical transfer where I was just sitting there and referred to Ukraine, and boom, within 12 hours, suddenly I get a response from someone who received on the other end and is explaining, we actually have had a virtual relationship for many years, but I never knew that before. And that's a magic that's available to everybody in this room. And some of you are finding ways to capitalize on that. It's an incredible medium that we have. The other thing about writing is that it forces us to stop. Jesus wrote, did you know that? What did he write? Anybody know? You're speaking in tongues, be clear. What did Jesus write? Somebody raise it. We don't know.
He wrote in the sand.
He wrote in the sand, right. Jesus understood about writing and publishing in crisis times. Because there was a crisis going on. This woman was caught in the very act of adultery, which in those days was a capital crime. It was punishable by death. Moses was clear. God was clear in Leviticus. Somebody gets caught in the act of adultery, they should be stoned. So the temple guards and the priest brought this woman. I mean, imagine the scene. She's about to be stoned. She's probably stripped down to her waist at least. She's ashamed. She's terrified. And she's trembling. And it's clear that the issue going on is not, does this woman deserve the crime? The issue is, how can we trap Jesus? John explains that in John 8. They're trying to trap Jesus because the law of Moses is clear, but Jews weren't allowed under Roman law to have capital punishment. And so they thought, we can trap Jesus. Well, anytime you can think you're trapping Jesus, forget it. He springs the trap right back. And that was the one occasion we wouldn't even know that Jesus knew how to write apart from that occasion. And so while everybody else wants an answer right away, what's he going to say? What's he going to say? We'll get him either way. Jesus won't go there. He stops. He pauses. He forces attention. It's a meditative moment. He forces the excitement to kind of cool down a little bit. And almost like poetry, Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature from Ireland, says that scene is a lot like poetry. It forces our attention for a second. When we don't know what's going to happen, it forces us to stop. Well, Jesus must not have had writers on a pedestal because that's the only time he wrote, and the only time he wrote it in sand so that the next windstorm, the next rainstorm washes it away. And imagine all these museums that have Jesus' thorn and Jesus' right toenail and things like that. What it would be great to have Jesus' one word that he wrote. But we don't even know what that word is. John didn't seem to care. That wasn't the point. But the point was what it did. It diffused that crisis. And then Jesus, of course, came up with the great, you could say, resolution. He didn't really resolve it. He threw it right back on them. Let whoever is without sin cast the first stone. And usually, in fact, in every case of adultery I know of, there are two people involved. But there's only a woman here, which makes you wonder, maybe the male was a Pharisee. Maybe they knew that. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And just that word just kind of lowered all the tension and people melted away. We're in tough times. You know that. This conference was postponed from 2020. There's a war going on bordering this country. But words have a certain power. They can take they can become transcendent and become much more than you think they are. They can serve a larger function than just mere words on a page. They transcend culture. They transcend time. You think of some of you got up this morning and started reading the Bible. That's a pattern that you have, that I often have. I didn't do it this morning, but starting with a book that's written 3,000 or 4,000 years ago in places, in a very different culture, and yet somehow those words that were written by, say, a psalmist who's out there tending sheep, so he's got a lot of time on his hands, and he writes things down, that can somehow leap across space and time and touch me clicking on my word processor, getting a digital copy from some Bible somewhere. What an amazing transcendence that those words can take on a life of their own that lives on and conveys something of God, something of truth across time, across space. In World War II, they were living in crisis times too. About a third of the world was run by Nazis. About a third of the world was run by either Stalinist or Maoist communism. So if you look at a map, there were very few truly free people, truly democratic places left in the world. And Christians were very concerned. A group of Christians, very elite, smart Christians in the UK, were very concerned. They included people like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden and Dorothy Sayers. They were all Christians. And they said, we can't write, Dorothy Sayers was writing murder mysteries. I can't write murder mysteries when the whole world looks like it's going up in flames. We've got to address the crises. So they started meeting together, and under T.S. Eliot, they actually started publishing a magazine on economics and on politics, because that was the most important thing. We've got to solve these problems. Not a single idea during the several years that magazine was in print has survived, nor has the magazine survived. Nobody goes and looks to them for wisdom. But the poems of T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden and the murder mysteries of Dorothy Sayers have survived. And it's easy in crisis times to think, oh, I got to write about the crisis. Well, I doubt that people in this room are going to really negotiate a settlement in the Ukraine. That's not what we're very good at. I wish somebody did, but I doubt it's going to come out of this room. We're not diplomats. We don't understand that. But we can, however, offer hope. We can offer comfort. We can offer perspective. That's what we are good at, publishing in crisis times. When the pandemic broke out, I started seeing books coming out on God and the coronavirus, and various things, and I thought, that book came out in 30 days. What could you come up with in 30 days that would give perspective on this worldwide global pandemic? And I decided, publishers were saying, okay, you've written about pain before, why don't you go back and just put in a few things about the coronavirus and republish it? And I thought, that doesn't seem right. And then I went way back, and I found one of the wisest statements on what happens in a pandemic like that was from John Donne 400 years ago. John Donne was the pastor, the vicar of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the largest churches in the world. And they had a real pandemic, the bubonic plague. About a third of London died. About a third fled out into the countryside to try to get away from the disease. And here John Donne was left as the pastor of the largest church in Britain. And people flocked to hear him. He was an eloquent person, one of England's greatest poets. And then he got sick. And John Donne lay there for about 6 weeks, thinking he was going to die. It turned out he didn't have the bubonic plague. He believed he did, and the doctors told him that he did. And as I read his wisdom, I realized there were parts of it that were just kind of crazy, and that's the science parts. You know, we tend to think hard science, that's things like medicine and chemistry and physics. Soft science, those are things like psychology and anthropology, counseling, things like that, soft science. But here was John Donne writing 400 years ago, and the, quote, hard science stuff is ridiculous now, because state-of-the-art medicine was bleeding people, the opposite of what you want, and applying pigeons to your nose and to your feet to draw away bad humorous vapors. That's ridiculous. Nobody does that today. But the wrestling with God, no man is an island, ask not for whom the bell tolls, these things have lived through the ages. For 400 years, that book has never been out of print. And it occurred to me that the things that we write about are the permanent things, not the passing things. And in the midst of a crisis, what we should be doing is lifting people's eyes to the permanent things, not just the Time magazine reports, but the things that last for 400 years, 3,000 years, and more. I got a letter once from a woman who was writing about my book, Disappointment with God. She said, it took me a long time to read your book because I was reading it during the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted about a decade. And she said, I lived in on the 13th story of a high-rise. And whenever the shelling came, I left your book in the basement. Whenever the shelling and the missiles and the rockets would come, all the lights would go out and we'd make our ways by candlelight down to the basement of our building, much like people in Ukraine do now. And I would light a kerosene lamp and I would read for a few pages or sometimes an hour until the all clear siren came. And I started thinking about myself writing that book. I was thinking of losing my keys, losing my car keys, and when my computer doesn't work or breaks down, or having an auto accident, that's what makes me disappointed with God, those kind of things. I wasn't thinking of this woman reading what I was writing in the midst of a war, much like the woman in Ukraine who wrote me just before coming over here saying, now I'm living your books. Now I'm living the questions that you write about. Words have that ability to transcend, to last, to become greater than we can possibly imagine and think they are. Here was a time when the most beautiful city in the Middle East was being smashed to smithereens, very much like the beautiful cities of Ukraine now. And there she is, hunkered down in a basement, people terrified, babies crying. What does God have to say about this? Does God care? Where can I find comfort? Where can I find hope? I got another letter about the same time from somebody else in Lebanon, and at one point in the various wars in Lebanon, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, moved in and took over large swaths of Beirut, particularly. And our friends had an apartment high up on a hill. So first, the PLO came in, they had machine guns, and they said, "We want your apartment." And of course, there's only one answer: "Okay, here are the keys." And then they installed a missile battery in the backyard. And of course, they knew that when missiles go out, usually missiles come back in. They thought, "We'll never see this apartment again." And she said, "I was reading your book, What's So Amazing About Grace, about the same time, and I was trying to show grace to these people, and I was doing a pretty good job. And then they said that I had to pay the utilities. And that was just a bridge too far. That was the last straw. It's one thing for them to take over my apartment, but for me to have to pay for their electricity and their water and their telephone bills, that's just not right." And she said, "So I'm trying to learn from your book on grace." And again, I'm sitting there thinking, when I was writing that book, I was thinking about the neighbor who lets his dog make messes in my yard, and the neighbor on the other side who plays his music too loud as a teenager with a garage band. I wasn't thinking of missile batteries in my backyard and men with machine guns taking over my apartment. But that's what our words can do. That's the power that they can have. Things that we think we understand and we put out there, if we ground them properly, God can use them in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. Jesus' first miracle, of course, was when he turned water into wine. Interesting miracle. His first miracle was a party miracle, really. And in C.S. Lewis's book on miracles, he said, that's what God has been doing all the time. In Italy, in Hungary has a great wine industry. People plant seeds, and God provides rain, and God provides sun. I haven't seen too much of it till I got here. Didn't see any in Budapest. But God gradually turns dead sticks into grapevines, and people can take the fruit of that and make wine out of it. That's nothing new. And C.S. Lewis goes on to say that miracles are really speeded up ordinaries. So if you twist your knee, you may have knee surgery. You say, "It's a miracle, I can walk again." Well, actually, God has been doing that. I've twisted my knee, and my knee has figured out how to heal itself. Miracles are just speeded up ordinaries. They're ways of what might happen anyway, but it does it at a much faster scale. And I think of the miracle of the words that we spend our time either writing, in my case, some of your cases, others of you as editors, others of you as publishers, getting out there, investing ourselves in these words, trying to pour ourselves in what we believe to be truth, trying to do it in a convincing, compelling way, and then we let it go. We lose control. And it's up to the reader who is now in control. They control all the gates. It's up to them whether they keep reading or not. And depending on how well we've done our job, they may. It's a miracle. There's a book in the United States by a man named Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote a book called Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut lived through one of the great disasters of World War II. It was the bombing of Dresden. Dresden is a lovely, beautiful city in the eastern part of Germany. And a lot of refugees, as well as American prisoners of war, were being held by the Nazis at the last days of the war. And for some reason, Winston Churchill and I suppose Roosevelt, and I don't know who all was involved in the decision, decided to bomb Dresden. So they did this firebombing where wave after wave of bombers came through and obliterated the town. 100,000 people died. more people died that night than died in Hiroshima or Nagasaki with the atomic bomb, one of the great disasters, including American POWs, including refugees fleeing. Terrible decision. And when Kurt Vonnegut wrote about it in Slaughterhouse-Five, he wrote an anti-war book. And in that book, he has a vision. It's a vision of the bombing of Dresden in reverse. So he's dreaming, or I forget whether he's asleep or awake, but he has this vision, and it starts with the city ablaze, and then the fires are sucked into these canisters, the bombs, and the canisters fly into the air, and there are these airplanes that have the bomb bays open, and the bombs fly into the bomb bays, and then it closes, and the planes fly backward to the UK, where they land backwards. And then those bombs are removed, and they're shipped on ships going backwards across the Atlantic to the United States, where they came from. And they're put in factories, and in factories they take the bombs apart, and they take all the different minerals out, and they take them to the mountains of the West, and they pack the minerals back where they came from. And that's his anti-war vision. If only it were like that. And sometimes I think about that in terms of publishing. I think of the woman in Ukraine. I think of the woman in Lebanon, Beirut, Lebanon. And I think, well, let's start with the woman in Lebanon. I think of her in her basement reading my book and then going backwards up the stairs and putting it back on the shelf. And then one day she takes the book off the shelf and she takes it to a local Christian bookstore and she puts it on their shelf. And then a salesman comes from the local Christian books publisher, and he takes the book off the bookshelf and he takes it back to his company, and he puts it in a box and sends it back to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where it came from, my publisher. And they take this book and run it through a printing press backwards, of course. At first they run the cover through and they take the 4 colors off, the primary colors one by one, and suddenly they're white now. And then they run through page by page of this black pepper marks on the page and erase them so that they're white. And then they take that and process the paper and finally go into the forests of British Columbia, Canada, and push that paper pulp back into the trees where it came from. And that's the miracle. The miracle is if you keep going all the way. I was in my early 30s when I wrote that book. We were living in downtown Chicago. There are so many distractions in a city like that. And I had a hard time just sitting at my desk all day. Video games were just starting to come out. And I would say to myself, okay, if you finish this chapter by 2 o'clock, then you could go play Pac-Man. Or you can have an ice cream cone. That's my reward for anything, ice cream cone. Mixed motives. You know, I wanted to have a book. I wanted to publish a book. This was whole new to me. I didn't know if it was going to work. I didn't know if I could make a living at it. And I had these mixed motives, the Pac-Man, the ice cream, finishing my chapter. And yet, reverse it, and you see what happens. Be with my mixed motives, pouring everything that I knew, everything that I had into the book that was in front of me at the time. And somehow, each stage is part of that miracle, that speeded up ordinary, that transfer from inside what's going on inside my mind to what's going on inside the reader's mind. I had no idea that one day there would be someone in Ukraine, someone in Lebanon, reading those words in a very different way than I thought when I wrote them. But that's the miracle. And the point of that miracle, I know not all of you are writers, not all of you are editors, not all of you are publishers. I met a bookstore manager here. But the point is, every step, every link in that chain is vital. If the salesman hadn't included my book in his little portfolio when he went to that bookstore in Lebanon, then the woman would never have gotten the book. If the person in the warehouse hadn't put it in the box that got on the ship, then she never would have gotten it. If I hadn't, with my mixed motives, finished the chapter that day, maybe I would have missed the deadline and I would have lost my contract. But every step in the chain is important. And we don't do all the steps. You do some of the steps that would baffle me. I have no idea. And those of you who are writers are doing some things that baffle the editors who are here. I know that. And the salespeople and others. But each one of us is part of the miracle of turning water into wine. The words that we come up with are the water. And we try to come up with the purest distilled water you could imagine. But we don't do the miracle. That's not our job. We are faithful to our link in the chain. And somehow God pulls them together in a way that we can't imagine and completes that process of that amazing transfer, this freedom-enhancing way of speaking to the most important things, even in the middle of crisis times. We think what can we do? What can we contribute? The world is a crazy place. We haven't had nuclear weapons yet, but my goodness, Iran is pretty close. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Who knows what the future will hold? Climate change, it's a scary world out there. And we may think sometimes, what do? We just put marks of pepper on a page. Well, that's true. That's what we do. But God can turn marks of pepper into paprika. God can turn water into wine. And that's our job. And as I have seen over and over, God can use words that I can't imagine where they came from, and I can't imagine how they would be used. My job is to try to be faithful, to come up with the very best words that I can. And if we do that, then we put out there the potential of the miracle of turning water into wine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. Philip's actually agreed to take a few questions. So I will give you 30 seconds to think of any questions you have, and then I think I have someone that will move around with the mic, or do I? No, I'm the mic. Or you're the mic. Okay, great. So that was your 30 seconds. Philip, I'll invite you back up.
This is another time when you see the difference in cultures, because some places there are hands in the air right away, and other places people are very shy.
Don't be shy.
I was in Singapore one time, and they had an open question and answer period. Singaporeans don't happen to be shy, but they were that day. Nobody raised their hand at all. Finally, some shy woman in the back said, Mr. Yancey, I have a question. What's that? What kind of shampoo do you use?
And the answer?
Whatever was in the hotel last night.
Brilliant. So now that we know what shampoo Philip uses, let's have some other questions. Hands in the air. Oh, good. Thank you. Brave lady here. And do try to keep your questions short.
Thank you for a brilliant exposition. My question is, I see that you do a lot of reading. So for a writer, reading others' books is an integral part of being a good writer? Your books are very good.
Yes, and that's one of my main concerns right now. Reading is changing deeply. I was raised under the kind of deep reading, so I would immerse myself. If I'm writing a book about Jesus, I would spend months. I think I spent 6 months in libraries before I wrote one word. And libraries, we'll have to explain to some of you what libraries are, you know. They're like Google before Google, but hard copies. And now, reading is always it's shorter, it's jerkier, it's interrupted constantly. So you see people on their phones all day long. I'm on my email all the time. And to spend 4 hours in an evening reading one of the great Russians, I can't do it anymore. I mean, if I did that, my email, I get a couple hundred a day. I would never catch up. And I think it's going to show in the quality of our writing. I don't know how you get the next generation, the current generation, to resist those forces, but it's a fire off an immediate response without giving much thought. That's what's wrong with social media. It's impulsive, it's immediate, it's not thought through, it's just a poor form of communication. And so, yeah, I think it's really important, and I also think it's in danger. It's an endangered species. And that's one of the things we can all do. There's a great book about how reading has changed called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, C-A-R-R. It's a wonderful book about how it changes the way we think. Western civilization and so much of what we depend on in science and medicine and these different areas like that have been built on that kind of deep reading, deep thought. And there's less and less of it going on. You go to medical school now, and it's not very conceptual. It's all about memorizing, learning the names of different drugs and medicines, and it's not a very well integrated. And that's just one field. There are a lot of other fields like that too. It's not really your question, but it's my soapbox.
My name is Isaac Newton. I'm from Colorado. And
that's really your name?
Yes.
Great. I've always wondered about gravity. If you
oh yes. 500 years old. I look pretty good for that. I can prove this. The theory of gravity. Take people up to the 4th floor and tell them if you don't believe it. My question is, in talking about the relevance of the times we're going through and the eternal truths that we write from the scriptures. I'm a mechanical engineer by profession, but love the scriptures. So I wrote a book called Fear Not, all the scriptures from the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. And when the Lord gave me the vision, He said, write this book, for time is coming when men's hearts are going to fail for fear for the things that are going to come upon this earth. That was back in 2010. Now, after this last 2 years of pandemic, I'm planning to relaunch the book titled as Fearless. But I'm puzzled when you said that you just keep it to the eternal, but should we also incorporate the effects of this pandemic that's happened, that's thrown people off. How do we give hope without addressing what's practically going on in the world today?
Well, yes, I must have miscommunicated. I actually wrote a paraphrase of John Donne that I published called A Companion in Crisis. So I took the parts of his that were timeless, and those were what I called the soft parts, the wrestling with God, and did an extensive introduction starting with the pandemic that we are going through. One of the things that I learned in doing that is to get the proper perspective on it. So, for example, of all the viruses in the world, and there are hundreds and thousands of viruses, what percentage of them do you think are harmful? What would you guess? Think of all the diseases caused by viruses. 1%, only 1% are harmful. The rest are very beneficial. They control bacteria. We would have a hard time living without them. And I think it's important when the whole world is terrified of this coronavirus, aptly so. Many people have died. Many people have gotten sick. But I go back to C.S. Lewis's old phrase that we live on a good world that's been spoiled, a good world spoiled. And it's easy in the middle of crisis times to forget we live in a good world. And one of the things that we can do as Christians is bring perspective. It is a beautiful world, Our bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made, amazingly designed. And I tried to do that in the book I did, redoing John Donne, trying to keep his classics, but bringing in the hook of what was going on around us. Especially, we live in a global society now that he didn't know then. He only was aware of what was going on in London, whereas now I can find out what's going on in Myanmar right away, how many people are in the hospital just by doing a few clicks on my computer. So it is a different world, and we should use that contemporary hook for sure.
Thank you. We've got space for maybe 2 more questions. I saw the lady in the pink jumper, so.
First of all, here's your apple. My name is Riham. I'm Syrian Egyptian. My question is, how about when the writer goes into writer's block? This is what the world calls it, or maybe it's imposter syndrome. But I call it like being deaf to the calling of God. Have you experienced a challenge that God is calling you to write, like about the war in Syria, for example? I'm trying to run away from this pain. I'm doing my master's degree in psychology, and my thesis is about grief and loss. Yet I'm running away from God's voice asking me to write about the crisis in Syria. So what would your advice be for a person who is burdened by God's calling, yet we are stubborn because God gives us the freedom to be stubborn, and we continue to be stubborn? So what would you advise us? And have you experienced the writer's block or the imposter syndrome?
I have not in that way. The things I start to write about are things that I want to write about. So I usually start with something I don't know. Those of you who are writers understand this, but when I tell people, when I don't know something, I write a book about it. Because it's my way of working it through and finding out some answers for myself. And so I choose the topics that I'm struggling with, that I have questions about, because it gives me a chance, usually at least a year, to spend trying to figure out, who is Jesus if he's not the person I grew up with? Does prayer really work? You know, those kind of questions. My books all come out of my own struggles. I would also say that that voice inside you must write about it. Sometimes we have to be very sensitive about the timing. Like a person who's just gone through a divorce, a person who's gone through an abuse or a rape or something like that. The year after it happened is not a good time usually to write about it. It takes some time to do some healing, to get some perspective, to rely on other supports around you. So it's an important voice. If you hear God calling you, you have to listen, but then listen also to what is the timing, what is the best time. Part of which is determined by the interest of the readers, you know. If you wait too long, of course, they don't really care about the war in Syria anymore. The what? You know. So, for instance, what's going on in Ukraine right now, I get daily email messages about the emergency, but it's not the time to write a perspectival book about the issues in the Ukraine, because we don't know how it's going to turn out, and we don't have that kind of distance that allows us the right perspective. So to me, it's a matter of timing rather than being a block in itself.
Thank you. So one last question. Oh, so many people. I'm afraid I'm going to get to this person more easily.
Philip, what is one personal habit that you have found as a writer to be most helpful that you could give us good advice on?
Habit's a bad word, isn't it? It relates a little bit to that phrase, writer's block. And when I started out, I thought the longer I wrote, you know, the older I got, it would become easier and easier, because by then I'd figure out what works and what doesn't work. The reverse is true. The older I get, the harder it is to write, because I know what I'm doing wrong as I do it. So I've got all these voices going off in my head. You've already said this before. This is so boring. It's a cliche. Nobody cares about this. And they're just going off constantly. And if you listen to those voices, you never write another word. And so when I hear those voices, I do what is called a guilt-free draft. And I just force myself to keep going, gritting my teeth the whole time. And ice cream, video games, whatever it takes to get me through that part, you know. I never got past Pac-Man, actually, so video games aren't an option. But just to block out all of those voices. And it never looks as bad the next morning as it feels when I'm doing it. That's something I had to learn painfully. One time I did a book where every other chapter I decided to slow down and try to make every sentence perfect. And just work on every possible sentence. And it was such a painful process. I mean, at the end of it, I would read every other chapter, and they would be roughly the same. This one had 14 drafts, and this one had 1 draft. But they took about the same amount of time. But this one was so much more painful and slow, and I never felt productive. So I went back to the get it out there, and then clean it up tomorrow style. Sure.
Thank you so much, Philip. Practicality, philosophy, so many things just in that question and answer session. Thank you so much. And I believe that you and your wife are here for a few more days. Is that right? You're 2 more days. Fantastic. Such generosity to stay, and hopefully you will meet some really wonderful people here, because I already have. Do we have John Most? Yes. So we will have some announcements. And we'll have slightly more announcements than general at times, because we had to do some from yesterday. So I'll let you go first.
Let's give Philip a big hand. I don't think we had a chance to do that.